All right, and we're good. So, welcome everybody, whoever everybody might be. Welcome to our Power Baseball League exploratory project, I guess is what we'll call it. Does that sound right? I think that's what we could
Yeah, I
call it.
think that's good.
Yeah. So, we decided, Kylie and I decided to kind of team up to give this a whirl. We were talking back and forth about how to learn all the different applications, how to kind of keep track of everything that the Microsoft Business Application Suite brings forward. And for anybody tuning in, I'm sure you know there's many different moving parts to what you can do. And one of the hardest things to do, I find anyways, is to keep on track and on top of all the different innovations that they come up with and all the things that they have at their disposal. And so an idea I had a long time ago for a blog, a written blog, was to basically create a league. And as a Canadian, I initially thought maybe I'll do a hockey league because my kids play hockey and I coach hockey. And I thought we could do a hockey league and I could try and essentially leverage Microsoft's business applications for all of the different things you would need to do if you were running a hockey league. And so this was just an idea that came up ages ago and it sat on a shelf for a long time. And then Kylie and I were chatting one day and we started talking through the idea and she thought, hey, that's a neat idea. What if we kind of worked on it together? And we talked through the idea of using hockey or other sports and landed on, as two baseball fans, landed on maybe we could do a baseball league because it's kind of similar to hockey and would resonate well. And there's lots of different aspects of running a baseball league, some of which we probably don't even know, and what we hope to uncover as we go through this. So that's kind of a very fast-forwarded version of how we got to where we are today. But essentially what we want to do is over the course of the next future months or weeks or whatever it may take us, however long, is essentially try and work through leveraging Microsoft's business applications to manage a baseball league, and likely a youth baseball league, I think, because that'll give us some ability to play with things like the different tiers of age groups that the kids have in different leagues, I guess what you'd call it, and or divisions, I guess is the right word. And then as we talked through how we might do that, we thought, why don't we start quite literally at the beginning and work ourselves through like the whole requirements gathering phase and just the discussion around what is it we're trying to achieve, and work our way through from there forward to actually starting to dive into specific applications. And as we talk through them, we'll start to identify, hey, we want an online registration form. Well, maybe we'll use, and I don't want to say it wrong, maybe we'll use the customer voice application for that, and to put a form out there so people can fill it in and that kind of stuff. So that's sort of where we are today, and we're gonna jump in with 2 feet and see where it takes us. Is that a good synopsis of what we talked about, Kylie?
Yeah, I think that sounds good. And I think it's going to be interesting to kind of work through this whole process. I think both of us have worked at customers where we're kind of in the middle of a very long ongoing project, right? But it's going to be interesting to start at the beginning and do kind of a whole project all encapsulated together. And so as we go into these first few days, as this was kind of Malcolm's vision, I'm going to kind of take the role of, I guess, a consultant or someone who's going to be asking the questions, doing the discovery, getting the requirements. And then after we kind of get through the initial requirements gathering, then this will become more collaborative as we move into the design phases and figuring those kind of things out.
And I think we should call out too that we don't have any specific vision, I guess this is what maybe we don't have specific applications that we're thinking about at this point. Like this is quite literally the beginning, and as much as we've talked about the idea, we haven't gotten into the we could use we could use CRM for this part of it, or one of the ERPs for another part, or anything like that, or Power Apps or Flow. I'm sure all of those things will come into play at some point, but we don't have necessarily a path. So we are quite literally starting right from the beginning of this whole endeavor,
right?
Which would be kind of cool.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the other thing too that we talked about is we're going to look at how we can break things up into logical pieces, right? And logical releases, just like you would in a real project. So we'll probably have lots of grand ideas, but we can't do all of those ideas all at once, right? So we'll kind of start and figure out how can we work in little pieces of those ideas, and how can we release kind of chunks that are fully self-contained, and then add on from there. So it's going to be exciting.
Sounds good. Well, why don't we dive in?
Yeah, I'll jump over to our notes that we're taking in teams. So we're really diving full in on the Microsoft stack here. So Malcolm, failures. Malcolm, why don't you get started with what your high-level goals are for this project?
Okay, so as we talked about, we want to do we want to run a baseball league. And so we want to use these applications to essentially facilitate everything we'd need to do when we do that. And so as much as we haven't thought about the applications, I did do a little bit of a brainstorm as we started to get ready for this first call, just around some of the specific areas that we'd want to track. But the goal is to give us a systematic, I was going to say system, but I think collection of systems is probably more accurate, that can help us manage all of the different facets. And so with that, and we'll maybe dig into specific requirements, but as we go through this, but like the players, the coaches, the maybe even the scheduling of the games. Baseball games have umpires. Maybe we need to schedule those. We want, as I mentioned in my example earlier, like a registration process, so maybe an online form. So we want to kind of do all of those different things. So we're looking at managing. I don't really know the best way to capture all that, but managing everything that we can through these systems.
Yeah, I put everything in quotes because we still have to figure out what that everything is, but yeah, exactly. We know we want to manage as much as we can with these technologies.
Yeah, cool. And to your point, we're not going to be able to do everything. Another thing is we're doing this sort of on the side, right? Like it's we're doing this to learn as we go, but we have lives and careers and things on the go. So we won't be able to do full on releases every few days, kind of thing. So we kind of have to keep it manageable.
It's the summer right now when baseball is cool, but soon it's going to become the winter, and then baseball is not cool anymore. So
true.
Then what are we going to do?
Then we'll do the hockey league.
Yeah, then we'll switch over. Okay. So who are you envisioning is going to be using this system primarily?
Well, let's go grand scale and say when we're all done with this, we're going to package this up and we're going to sell it to youth baseball leagues in North America.
Okay.
I mean, it's good to have goals, right?
How much do you want to sell it for?
Well, we'll see how comprehensive it is.
As long as we don't have to also talk to them about their Microsoft licensing, it'll be fun.
That's right. Well said.
Okay, so you want to sell it to these youth baseball leagues. Okay. So, yeah, we're imagining the league is going to have to be able to administer this themselves.
Correct. I have another thought when you're done with that, too.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
So when we think about, and for the record, I don't, as much as I coach sports, I don't necessarily see the association side of the sports per se. But one of the things that I can only imagine, based on the organizational level of communications and things that I've seen come out of some of these associations, I think that this would bring some efficiency. So one of the goals would be to bring some efficiency to the management of all of this, right? I have reason to believe. And actually, I think I can say this with fair confidence because I do know some of the executives on some of these local ones where I live, where they don't have a lot of systematic processes in place to deal with a lot of this stuff. Even from as a coach, I've always marveled at the inconsistency at which we receive communications from the league about the upcoming season and planning. And of course, they're dealing on a shoestring budget and they don't have a lot. But I think a system like this could really help them achieve some efficiencies and effectiveness in how they go through all that stuff.
Yeah, well, that might bring out a good requirement too, like around communications, around like when things change, automatically notifying people, because definitely I'm not involved in sports, but in any of the volunteer things I'm involved in, it's the same thing. You late communications, nobody knows who's doing what, and there's just a lack of consistency. So, which is something this can bring. But also the self-service part too. If people have a Power App or something, or a portal, maybe we shouldn't be crazy and start talking about portals, but if they have a portal that they can log into to get all of this data, then maybe they don't need as much proactive communication or reactive communication, which way ever. Okay, excellent. Are there any other high-level goals?
Yeah, I think paper. There's still probably a pretty heavy reliance on paper that could probably be reduced. And I used to work for many years at a nonprofit, and one of the big conversations year in year out was, how do we go paperless? And we'd often try and pivot that conversation to focus not on being paperless, but using less paper. There's some things you need a signature. Sometimes you need a piece of paper, or you need an official criminal records check or whatever. It's got to have the proper stamp, and then your policies dictate that. You can't necessarily get rid of that paper, or maybe you can, but that's something that I think there's probably still a lot of paper-based stuff that we could eliminate or reduce as we go through this.
Yeah, agreed. And now, there's so many e-signature things, but that won't be in release 1.
Yeah, fair enough. But it surfaces so many interesting conversations that I think we might dive into as we go through this, right? Like the whole bit around an e-signature, I think, is a great solution, but we have to keep in mind, if we're dealing with the youth, there's a lot of programs out there that exist to enable the ability of youth to play sports through funding and whatnot, because they don't have it. If a family can't necessarily afford to put their child in a sport and is relying on those kinds of supports, there is, believe it or not, even though we're in the wild year of 2020, it is possible that a family doesn't have access to a functional computer or the internet to do any signature. So there has to be those other options. So there's lots of nuanced elements to this whole thing. So that's maybe getting into the weeds a bit, but.
Yeah, so many little details that happen in there, and even like background checks that you mentioned, which are very different in America and Canada too. Yeah. So if you're saying all of North America, if we get down into those weeds, there's lots there.
Right. Fair enough.
Okay. Yeah. So that's a pretty big group of goals that we're going to collect there. So I guess maybe from goals, we should actually go into what would you consider success for this project? And I think asking that question now would be, we know success for you and me for this project is learning new tools and actually sitting down and kind of doing a big project like this.
Yeah.
But let's talk if you are in terms of someone working at this youth baseball league, what would success look like for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and a good way to frame it, right? To look at it as if we are the customer. So I think that's a really good question. I don't necessarily know the answer to that off the top of my head. I think achieving some of the things we talked about above, and I think my hesitation and struggle to answer that is, some of those aren't going to happen out of the gate. So maybe we want to define success based on, I don't want to say necessarily a time range, but maybe first we want to identify success. The first successful aspect of this whole project, I think, is to identify what is the base going to be. So where's this data going to sit? Yeah. And who's going to have access to it? Who in our association is going to use it? That, I think that's a start, but in the grand scheme of like running the league, I think if we were really a baseball league, we would have very concrete examples. Like, we have a paper application form. We want to eliminate that. We want to have an online application where we get 85% of our applications through the online forum instead of a paper application. That could be an indicator of success.
said what, 80%?
80, 85, 80 is fine.
Right. And we also talked about reduction of paper. And we could say by 75%, something like that. I guess I'm also trying to make this a little bit measurable too,
Measurable,
right?
yeah, I agree. Yeah.
So probably for day one, I put your kind of data question down in open questions, but I think because I think there's more that we want to dig into there, so I didn't want to get lost in our notes. But it does probably bring up a good day one would be there is some system that people have access to, right? Yeah. And that our data is there, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and then I think reports, that being able to understand the demographics, and again, we're leaning on some assumptions here, but assuming that they don't have a great comprehensive system that's tracking the demographics of all the players, and again, speaking from experience, having registered our own boys, we don't put in a ton of data about who they are, and other than their age and gender, and that's about it. And so, maybe there's more that we would be able to better understand who's participating in our league, also better understand who's not participating in our league, so that we can maybe target recruit for whether it's coaches or participants and children and youth, and things like that.
Something like that.
I think you also, again, success, you talked about that communications piece coming up, that we have more consistency in our communication. And I think we probably need to contextualize that a little bit. Like, what does that mean? But as a high level goal to put on there, that we can streamline and bring consistency to our communication.
Which could be, I think we could, for day one, maybe we could simplify that down to like schedule reminders, maybe for volunteers, maybe not all the way to teams.
Yep. Yeah, I imagine you'd want to schedule, for your volunteers and your coaches, so that and your league participants, that hey, the registration date is closing in a week. Get the early bird price now, or whatever that exists where we are for some of our sports league. If you register by this date, it's cheaper. Well, prompt them to register by that date, and then and then follow up and say, well,
parents have nothing else going on, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Cool. I think those are some good goals. All right. So let's maybe we can dig into those a little bit more. So we said system in place with data and access, right? So let's dig into that. Let's break this into our data and our access. I kind of want to start with access. Speaking of who we think is going to use this system, so we might be able to filter out some of the noise here. So I guess what I'm thinking is when we talk about the families, right? So you're registering your kids. Are you expecting them to have access to this system, or what are you expecting them to do?
No, I expect them to feed the system. So they're filling in or providing information that's being put into the system, but I don't think that they're users of the system.
Right. But potentially, if for MVP 12 there is a portal, that might change. But for our day one, right, they won't. Okay. So who are you envisioning would have access?
So I imagine our association staff. Right. So assuming that we have a group of individuals that work to bring the association to life, they would have access to this. Maybe coaches would have access to it, or at least access to elements of it.
Right.
I think that makes sense. Right. I think a coach who signs up and they're assigned to a team should have access to some of the data and lists that we have about that team, but maybe not all teams. So there's maybe some layers of access that we need to deal with here.
Yeah, and then I guess when you start thinking like, well, when we're talking about youth leagues, they don't have like drafts, right? Like Well, I guess some kids leagues do have drafts, right?
They do. They do. Well, we do. So again, leaning on coaching, my hockey coaching experience, and I know the baseball world's similar in this regard. They do a draft. Um, so there's tryouts for the A divisions
Right.
and the rep teams, and then the kids that don't get selected there. There's where I live. There's multiple levels. So there's like your top tier, and then your
Right.
secondary tier, and then your house league tier. And so essentially the remaining children that aren't on those teams. Plus, there's a number of kids that just don't want to play in that.
Right.
They don't want to even try out. They just play in the house league right out the gate. So there's a draft there where teams are selected. But it is actually that's a really good call. So there's a rating system that happens. So there's a couple of tryouts that are held. They're more assessments, not really tryouts. And the kids are sort of ranked, and then all of the coaches get together and agree upon the rankings for all the children that are available. And then there's a whole, we call it a draft. Probably it's not like a random thing. It's an intentional, but you could have certain specific kids that you saw in the tryout on the field say, wow, that kid can really hit, can really run. I really want that guy on this team. And then another team could pick them, and you got to have secondary choices. So a system that could help that unfold might be something to consider as well.
Yeah. And so I guess when we're thinking of access, in that case, the coaches would need access to see all kids and their rank.
Yep.
But they probably would not see other data about them. Like they'd see their age and their whatever, but they wouldn't see their address. Although I guess even when they're their coach, would there even be a reason for them to see? They probably would never see address, but maybe phone number, right?
There could be. There could be address for pickup. Yeah. There's there's scenarios where kids maybe can't. Maybe parents are working different hours and can't make it, so they need to coordinate rides and whatnot. I mean, that doesn't have to be in the information shared. It could be like, hey, if you need a ride, you coordinate with somebody and then you share your address. But we typically do receive a list of all the players and their children's, the name, the parents' names, their contact information, including their address. For our team, like for the team that we're coaching. There's a lot. There's a lot that we can dig into here.
Yeah. You're like, what have I committed to?
Yeah. Wait a minute.
All right. For your own team, we're seeing phone. And they're going to need age too. Cool. Okay. And they probably need like parent/guardian. Making sure the right person picks them up.
Yeah.
All those kind of things. Okay, so coaches, association staff. I did write volunteers here, but I guess there's probably different tiers of volunteers, so that might come up later as well. And we had mentioned referees, so I guess that we could maybe call them game day volunteers or staff. Do you think?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Would they maybe need access, right? But they would only need access to scheduling information, right?
Yeah, for their games.
Okay. All right, that's interesting. Okay, so who else? Are we missing anybody else?
Well, I'm just looking at some of these notes.
Or is there anybody else who does not have access, maybe? We also talked about donors.
Yeah, fundraising, and that's a huge part of local minor league sports is fundraising and getting sponsorships for your team and that kind of stuff. So there's definitely a fundraising aspect here. How in depth we want to take that, I don't know, but there's definitely a requirement there. There's also equipment management, so it gets away from people and access, but another point to consider.
Yeah, in our data.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Equipment. So equipment management. There's also scheduling and facility management, or like field management, right? Making sure that we're not double booking teams, especially when you get into teams. If we really want to push complexity, we can get into like we have teams that are traveling to other centers, and they, we got to make sure
Right.
they have home games and away games, and yeah, it gets. I still it's one role I don't understand how they do life is a scheduler, any of these things, but
yeah, so I think going back to that for day one, we would have kind of manual scheduling.
Yeah.
But visibility in system, right? And then future, some kind of assisted scheduling of some kind, right?
Yep.
Would be the goal.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
There's also season management, so like standings, schedule we've got on there, but for a team, they should have access to their schedule. I guess that's scheduling.
Apparently, I don't know how to spell management. I've spelled it wrong every time.
I'm not counting.
I don't know.
It's only 4 times though, but
it's only 4 times.
Just keeping track.
No big deal.
The standings, right? So how's the team performing? Their their wins or losses, and maybe even stats around them. So again, how in depth do we want to go? But you want to understand how many games they've won, they've lost, how many runs they've scored, how many runs they've given up. Mm-hmm. I mean, this isn't Major League Baseball. We don't need like some of those intense stats that the real statisticians keep track of. But there's definitely information that we should be tracking.
Right. I kind of was jumping back to capture more of these notes on players that we had talked about.
Yeah, age group, definitely their level of play. So whether it's rep versus house league versus whatever you call them. One of the things we have here is what's called AP, or affiliated player, which this is something that really a league needs to pay attention to. There are rules around how you can borrow a player from a league, essentially a league below. So a house league player can be borrowed. Maybe they're a really strong house league player. They didn't make the like divisional rep team, but they can be called up. So if this team suffered injuries or illness or whatever, they can actually pull kids up. But there's specific parameters around like provincial and countrywide rules that apply, that you can only have so many times a year that player is called up. They can only play so many in a row. They have to. So keeping track of those AP players and who they are and where they're being called up to and who they're affiliated with, that kind of stuff might be something. And again, this is just a brainstorm, so it doesn't mean we have to do all of these things, but that's one of the things that hit the list.
What was it called? Associated player?
Affiliated player. There's also, we might want to keep track of the teams they play on.
Yeah. Right.
Or you've got teams, yeah. For players and for coaches, I mean, suspensions are a real thing. So that might be something we need to track. And there are specific rules around if you're suspended so many times, you can't play in the playoffs, or you can only play for so much, or like it's, and again, how deeply we get into that, but those are things that a league would need to be mindful of, is where I'm going, right?
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, and there's so many cool things we could do. Like, is there a way that if a coach was viewing their team and they could see like certain players in the orange or yellow, call them out visually to know that they're kind of getting near that limit. And, it might also be something a coach wants to know if we do talk about draft, like, is that going to influence the players that you choose next season? How many times they were suspended last season?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. What other data are we missing? Oh, we didn't put anything here about the fundraising stuff we talked about, but that's great. That's great stuff. I would say maybe that's not day one.
No, I agree. It's not day one.
Because that's a whole other ball of wax.
But in that, I would put league and team sponsorships and donation. you can leave what you put, donations for sure.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about donors, then we want to also be capturing, not loyalty. What's the word when they like annual giving, I guess?
Yeah, annual giving campaigns or whatnot.
Right. Oh yeah, campaigns related to that. Okay. What else?
Donations, just donation software is a massive industry. So there's many things we could layer in there if need be, but maybe one of the solutions is, look, it's so complex, you should go out and get a bolt-on solution, right? That is built in. There are several donation-based solutions that exist in the market that are targeted toward fundraising and fundraising initiatives that you could plug into an environment.
Right, because of tax receipts and those sorts of things that are huge, a huge thing in there. Okay. What else? What other data do we have to be talking about?
There was two more things on my list that I had in my original brain dump was awards. So keeping track, which could be its own category, or maybe it gets layered into players and coaches. But you do recognize, those things, and whether it's by team or by the entire association or whatnot. That's the thing that we would keep track of. And then also board of directors is a thing in most, and I'm thinking through the nonprofit lens here, but not necessarily just the nonprofit lens, but the board of directors is something we might want to keep track of. Who's on the board, how long have they sat, who's the chair, who's the secretary, who's the vice, and all that kind of stuff.
And also not alumni members, past board members.
Yep.
Because they're probably now donors. They're still involved. They're still very influential.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing you had mentioned here too is families. So something that we have to keep in mind is a player's relationship with other players.
Yep, that's a good call.
And that's going to be interesting. Well, I think that could flow into a lot of things, because when a human is scheduling, they can quickly think about, oh, hey, these kids are in separate leagues. We have to make sure their games don't conflict. But when a computer is doing it, you would need to somehow plan in all those things, if that would be something that we would need to do.
I wish the league cared.
They don't do
that. They don't. Although we've been fortunate. Our family specifically, we have two boys that every other year they play a league, and we've been pretty lucky. But they typically don't. But it is definitely something you want to understand. Like if there's, from a driving registration perspective, if you get a registration from one and not another, and there's other kids in the family, maybe that prompts a call out to the family and be like, hey, is it, you never want to see a child not be able to play because of financial burdens or whatever. Especially we're starting all this in 2020. There's a lot of conversation happening right now about like, what is this season going to look like next year or this fall or whatever, and for different sports, and a financial concern for a lot of people is very real, right? Lots of people impacted, and so they're like, well, we can't afford to play, and so that's a unfortunate place to be. So
that's so sad. That makes me so sad.
It does. I know, it's pretty awful. Well, that's lots. I mean, that's
a lot of things.
That's a lot of stuff. And that's just the start. And I think what we're going to find as we go through is, as we build elements out, be like, oh, okay, well, we can use this tool for that, and we can do this. I suspect we're going to find ourselves in a scenario where we're like, oh, and we could do this, and we could do this, and this, and this, and at the top of the call, didn't you mention something about like a potentially a app of some sort that speaks to the scoreboard so that it could update automatically, like this, we could get into awesome. We could get into some pretty cool.
To go on for a long time. Yeah, and I think the other things, like some of our users too, we didn't include in our data list, but that's something I'm going to write them here too, so we don't forget. Coaches, refs, and volunteers. because we're going to need to link them with things too.
Definitely.
For scheduling. Okay. Yeah. So that's a pretty big list of things for day one, but I feel like we've probably accomplished what we were hoping to for our first session, because we kind of went through and figured out the who, the what, and the why of what we want to do. And we've even started to kind of call out what will be future and what will be now. So I'm thinking what we're going to pick up with next time would be, let's get rid of all the future stuff, think about just today, and start digging into the actual requirements of these items so that we can get to, hopefully in a few sessions, to actually building out the data map.
Yeah.
And I think one thing I would say on that is, I know me for sure, I'm so tempted, even just looking at this list, I'm like, oh, this is so easy to just let me start building out this player entity and just build it, and decide, just start doing things. But I think one thing we really wanted to stress in this series is the importance of planning. And like looking at this list of data here, there are so many relationships that we do need to take careful time to map them out and figure out how they should work and how it should look, so that we don't get down the road and have something we need to clean up from later. So so I think it's going to be good that we're taking the time to dig into these things and figure it out. So
well, and I hope we don't run into that scenario, but I almost think I'm okay if we do, because for those watching, if you're somebody who's just kind of dabbling in these tools and things, it's a very real scenario. Try as you might to avoid it, to go down that path and get down, what looks like a really promising avenue, and then all of a sudden you turn a corner and realize, wait a minute, this actually isn't necessarily going to work for the way we, what we wanted to. And again, it's never a fun scenario to go down, but it's I'm a big believer, as corny as it may sound, that it's not a failure. You're learning as you go, and that's a huge part of all of this. Some of these applications that I think we're going to probably dabble with while we go through this are things that I really probably don't even know how to spell, never mind what they do. So there's a big learning curve to some of these things, and I think it's okay for us to kind of knock on some doors that maybe don't pan out, and because that is a reality of what happens sometimes.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think it's good for people to see that, people who've been doing this for a long time run into that scenario.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right.
Sounds good. Well, that's a good first start. I think that's a good first session. I hope for those of you who tuned in, or we're recording these so we can put them out. If you if you're intrigued, and I hope you are, or if you have ideas, please keep following along, and please hit us up. Let's shoot us your notes and thoughts and what you think, and where you think we could take it, or if you have cool ideas about something you heard today, you'd be like, oh, you guys could totally use this tool to accomplish that. We would love to hear that, because this isn't just the Malcolm and Kylie show. This is any input you have. We're welcome to entertain, and maybe we'll even pull in some guests as we go.
Yeah, for sure. I just pulled our slide back up so everyone can see where to find us, and we'll see you guys next time.
Sounds good. Thanks, Kylie.
Thanks.